I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, home to the one and only story cycle system. Do you want people to actually give a crap about you and your purpose-driven company? Then our proven system will help you tell them a better friggin' story. And that's the secret sauce, folks. You gotta have a better, clear story. You can get started right now by downloading your 64-page DIY brand story strategy workbook at businessofstory.com. It's filled with examples, links to tutorial videos, and will help you clarify your story to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. And if you're really proud of how your brand story comes together, let me know. We might put you on our show to share your new narrative with the world. So download your story cycle guide right now as you listen to today's show.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Earlier this year, on Friday, January 12th to be exact, a chapter closed in my life. You see, after 5 years as the professor of storytelling, creating and teaching the communications curriculum for the Executive Masters of Sustainability Leadership program at Arizona State University, I know that's a mouthful, I passed my quill on to a new instructor. We just graduated our 4th cohort that afternoon, and during the celebration, I got to share my thanks with our graduates and say goodbye to a program that has had a tremendous impact on me. So I wanted to make it as memorable as possible, and I started with this ancient tale, introducing them to this mystic by the name of Nasruddin. They say Nasruddin was both brilliant and foolish. But the problem was I kept tripping over Nasruddin, so I changed the guy's name to George. And by the way, that made everybody laugh because George was one of the amazing professors that I got to teach with in the Executive Master's program. It's Dr. George Basil, to be exact. He is a biophysicist, so he's got the smarts of a mystic, but he's also pretty crazy. He's got the marketing chops of a David Ogilvy and the delivery of a caffeinated stand-up comic. So now you got a sense of who our strategy instructor was all about at EMSL. By the way, I also got to teach with Bruno Sarda, Vice President of Sustainability for NRG, who is a global context professor, and the amazing Dr. Kevin Gazzara, the co-founder of Magna Leadership. But back to our story already in progress. Nasruddin is now George, and I went on with our students and I said to them, a seeker of George had looked for him for many, many years to ask him a question that burned in her heart. She found him in a Marrakesh market, sitting atop a pile of banana peels. Such is the dichotomy of life I mentioned. It's essential that seriousness and foolishness coexist for our sanity. They all seem to nod at that one. Anyways, this young lady looked up at George, who appeared to be deep in meditation. She cleared her throat to get his attention and said, "Oh, great sage, I must ask you a very important question, the answer to which we all seek." George, in a moment, opened his left eye and looked down at the young lady. "What is it?" he replied. "Tell me the secret to attaining happiness." George thought for a time, then responded, "The secret to happiness is good judgment." "Ah," said the student, "but how do we attain good judgment?" "From experience," George answered. "Yes," she said, "of course, experience. But how do we attain experience?" "Bad judgment." Well, the class laughed, enjoyed this unexpected tale. My hope was that it would be something that they would retell down the road and make this point a little bit poignant and memorable to them. But I also want to make a business point to them. I used the story to create a moment in time that I hope they won't soon forget. And I tied the tale to their own EMSL journey to make it as relevant to each one of them as possible. I reminded them of the good judgment they demonstrated about a year and a half ago where they actually registered for the program and then went on to invest their hard-earned money and their time to elevate their leadership skills and differentiate their personal brands through the lens of sustainability. They all grinned and nodded in agreement. Then I reminded them of the highs and lows they experienced in the course. How many times did you feel like this was a mistake, I asked them, or that you weren't good enough or smart enough to make it through, or that you just wanted to quit, I asked. Most again nodded in agreement. They all felt that at one point or another. And what about the times when you had to redo a paper or an assignment because your judgment wasn't as clear as it needed to be? Well, a few shared knowing smiles with me at that as well. But all of that good and bad judgment, I went on, has created a transformative experience for you that has changed the course of your life, which will also change the course of other lives because of your dedication to social causes and the environment. And here you are now on one of the happiest days of your life, graduation day. I close by thanking them for investing in themselves and sharing their life with me as their sustainable storytelling instructor. And I acknowledged how much I have learned from them and how EMSL has transformed me as a human being as well. But I'll save those stories for another show. Anyway, I pulled Nasruddin's story from the pages of Jay Golden's wonderful new book, Retellable, How Your Essential Stories Unlock Power and Purpose. Of all the stories he shares in his book, this parable made me laugh. I couldn't forget it. And it was like perfect timing too, because I needed something to go out with the students. And I thought that this perfect story was just ideal to retell to them because it connected with them in such a powerful way. And, such is the power of stories, your personal story or one you pull from the archives. Find the right time and place to share it with the right people to make your business points, and you too will become retellable. So on today's show, Jay will be here with us, and he's going to introduce you to his journey curve and how you can make your true stories memorable and immensely shareable. And if you like what you hear, share this episode with a friend, family, or colleague. That's right, retell them what you heard about here on today's show with the author of Retellable, Jay Golden. Let's get after it. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Park.
Yeah, now you are coming to us not from the Bay Area, but you just recently moved up to Ashland, Oregon?
That's right. After 22 years in the Bay, my wife and I looked up and we said, we actually don't need to do this anymore. We can live wherever we want.
So what were you doing in the Bay Area that then maybe drove you so crazy to the point that you said, we don't have to do this anymore and we get to move to Oregon?
For many years, I was working at the edge of the internet world. So beginning 1995, early storytelling in the territory of online learning, some of the first online learning content that was out there, went through a variety of different territories at the edge of content, from online videos to viral videos, animation, then also web series, and the beginning of mobile apps.
Were you doing this in the advertising marketing world, or you said online? Were you just education, or how were you using these channels?
Yeah, it was mostly variety of different purposes for content. Early on, it was a product that I was on the founding team of, this site called learn2.com, which was the first global learning site that was very character-centric. Then later, it was much more marketing focused through brand and kind of purpose-driven advertising, movies online in the early 2000s, focusing on delivering critical messages through using comedy and intelligent media that would be passed from person to person. So some of the early viral media.
So you were working in those kinds, and also sort of training in this world as well?
The training really came on later. That was when after I began this business in earnest about 10 years ago.
And this business in earnest is Retellable?
Yeah, basically what happened after I had worked in so many different sectors of online media is I looked around and I said, every single new emerging form of media is connected to the same place, and that same place is not the next new, but it's something very old. It's something called a story. And 10 years ago, when I came out with my shingle and said, hey, I'm creating a business focused on storytelling. Everybody said, wow, that's great. So you're going to be making videos. Because that's what I had been doing. And I said, actually, I'm focused on the center of all of this, because at the end of the day, after these thousands of bits and bytes of information that we take in every single day, we only remember a few, and those are the stories. And so I began and focus on how to get not just to the center of it all, not just to help people to tell stories, but really to find what are those stories that are most remembered, what are those critical insights and lessons, and how do they inform our lives, the lives of the leaders that I work with, and the lives of change makers and innovators that are out there every day, standing in front of 1,000 people or standing in front of 20 people and telling their stories.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. I just, in fact, commented or put an article in Business Magazine here in Phoenix, and their question was very much what you recognize, that you were working in all these different digital platforms and channels, and everybody gets that confused with what their brand message is. And so they asked me, they said, now the technology's here, how should brands approach technology and let the technology kind of morph their brand? And I said, that's the wrong question, I believe. And I compared it to the Flintstones and the Jetsons, two of my favorite, cartoons growing up as a kid. So you got the modern prehistoric family with the Flintstones. And then, of course, you've got Meet George Jetson and Jane, his wife. And to me, technology is all about the Jetsons. It's all efficiency. It's flashy. You can reach around the universe with it. It's all wonderful. But when it gets back to really telling your story, you got to go back to those primal days of the Flintstones. And you got to start there, because it is the way we're hardwired. I mean, its story is what has made us human, which has taken us from the caveman to consumer. So people in this day and age of technology and this space age that I can be around the world, in an instant with my message, think that's what the brand's about. But it's really not. To your point, it's about finding that story that connects on our very primal basal level. And until you do that, it almost doesn't matter. Well, it totally doesn't matter what channel you're on until you get your story straight.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the focus really is about connection, and how do you authentically connect with a living story and with your living audience. And the variety of methods that you use that's really a second question. The core question, and the place that I operate from, is what is that greater story that you're telling out in the world? What is that greater journey that you're depicting that you want your audience to come along on? And I know, having listened to your podcast and some of the amazing content that you've compiled, I mean, you've got like a Hall of Fame collection of people and different insights of how people use story. And it's really a poignant time right now, because in a way we're racing after the tools, and we're forgetting the true technique that is authentically an act of human connection.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it always comes back to. And I think from what I've seen in my 30 years of brand marketing is that brands got lazy about the story side when they own the influence of mass media, TV, radio, print, and they could just cram messages down your throat. Creativity, they were more fascinated by creativity versus real stories, true stories well told. Motion graphics came in, and they just became like a whole bunch of little fishing lures. And it just seemed like brands lost the skill around narrative, around connecting the way we've always connected since we walked around the Serengeti. And that comes back to story. So I like this idea about the core question of what is the greater story. So give us an example of what you mean by that. Like, if you got a client or something that, because I can just hear clients say, well, what does he mean by this core story, this greater story? How do you define that?
Yeah, and I think the basic question that I always come back to is it retellable? Is a story actually the next day, after you've taken in 100,000 words and 34 gigabytes of information, the next day when you sit and you sip your coffee, what still is alive inside of you as an audience member yourself? What still is alive in you? What are you compelled to? What could you actually step up and retell? And so setting a litmus test of a retellable story is kind of the beginning. And it's not to say that the aspects of technology that help to distribute that aren't absolutely critical, and not that to say that they're not absolutely fun and amazing to make use of. But it's to say, always ask this question: how can we take this transformative journey, this aspect of change that lives inside of a profound story, and make use of it? Let me give you an example. So I have a client who's got he's got a company of 250 people. His company is actually in the roofing business. I work with people all across the different sectors, from travel to various nonprofit environmental sectors to recruiting, a variety of different directions. But this particular guy, Charles, he's got a roofing company, and he began his career specifically as a one-person business. And he was out there just trying to make his living, and would take any call. And he ended up at this house, and somebody said, "Hey, I've got a leak in my roof." And he showed up there, and he's like, "Oh no, this is not going to be a job that's going to help me. I need to pay my mortgage. I have to do the basics here. I need to." They could tell that it was kind of trouble. It was a very small house. It was in really bad shape, and he saw the woman that was at the door, and she had called, and he was about to apologize because he was really strapped early in his career. And then as he was about to say this, as he has this dialogue in his head, this young girl, about 5 years old, grabs his hand and took him into her room. And he's walking in, and he looks, and he realizes that that's where this scent that he had smelled, the scent of mildew, was all from the leaks in her room. And as he tells this story, he describes this poster of a unicorn on the wall, and the deep scent, and the smile on the girl's face. And he looked down, and he saw these mattresses that are mildewed, and he looked, and he said, I can't say no to this project. And so he called his friends, actually competitors. He brought them all together, and they fixed this roof. And this is now 15 years later, and he's got a company that is absolutely thriving because they're constantly dedicated to this recognition that purposeful work, meaning gathering people together to help others in need, can be not only entirely transformative, but it's very good for business. And so I tell this because now he's won awards. He just won the National Chamber of Commerce Award, and he's constantly getting media attention. I say this because it's not just, that's an origin story, right? That's the beginning, but it's not just one story that you tell. You're constantly, as a leader, you're constantly out there telling different stories that deliver on the trajectory of the change that you're wanting to create in your life. And so that's a big part of what I work with when I work with leaders, is to help them gather their collection of stories, not just one story. I mean, your one story can become so calcified that everybody else is looking at you and saying, "Oh my gosh, I want to hear that story again." But you're saying in your heart, you're realizing that story is kind of flat. It's become cardboard, and you need to find new ways to tell it. And the way that you find new ways to tell it is to look at your constellation of stories, to gather a new story every week or every month and find a new way to deliver on the change that you're creating in the world.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this a little bit, because great story and finding stories. So often I hear in the work that I do in coaching and speaking and consulting is, I don't have a story. I don't really know what a story is, or I'm already a good storyteller, and they get up and they spew a bunch of opinions, facts, and assertions, and there's no real story to it. And you've got this nice 4-step journey model that I really like, that I want to talk about. And before we get into that, what I liked about that story you just shared is I heard this quote from someone that said, "Your story is only as good as your villain is evil." So in this case, what's the villain in this story? The villain is the mold. You have a damsel in distress in this young girl, And then, talking about her posters up and that sort of thing. So you really get to the specifics of it. And you're playing to one of the most moral imperatives you can play to get people to act, and that is disgust. So people are thinking care and harm for this child. We got to take care of this child. And it's triggered through the disgust of mold, because we can all picture that mold through this dripping, sieve of a room this little girl's living in, and that can't be healthy for her. And what it did for him, it propelled him into action, got other like-minded people in action. And anybody listening to that story would probably sit there, unless they're as cold and heartless as those drips are, they say, yeah, I would get involved. I would live, I can live vicariously through this guy and understand how I would do that exact same thing in my business. So they can relate to this story, but it has these wonderful elements of, a villain mold, disgust, caring for this child, and more importantly then, or as equally important, is caring for the overall household. And then what does this story say about him? That he's got a heart much bigger than his back pocket for his wallet. He's going to do what's right first. And then that leads to more business. So if you're out there hiring roofers or contractors and you had 2 bids come in, who would you pay for, even if they were a little bit more once you heard that story?
Yeah, I think that's great. I also think that so much of this is about internal conflict. I find again and again with innovators, whether it's a person who's standing in front of 1,000 people, or somebody who's trying to recruit a candidate that's representing their essential culture of their organization, that the juiciest stories truly represent a deep dive into a conflict, and it's oftentimes not external. Although you're exactly right, that mildew became the thing that they went against. They went to fight against, and I'm sure that's what he spoke out to when he rallied his friends and his associates and his companies that he was even working against at that time, and brought everybody together for a common cause. I also think that moment of the deep mystery, that what Joseph Campbell called the innermost cave, that territory where you're at the bottom and you don't know what to do, and all you can do is sit and wait. And that wait for that moment, that second where you don't know what to do, that's where so much power comes from. And I find that innovators and founders and true leaders find themselves in that place, and they know how to navigate it. Sometimes they push, but a lot of times they listen. And that listening is so critical, because it's what makes a great story. It's what brings that until finally moment at the bottom of the gully that truly creates transformation and becomes a story of change that other people will retell.
Okay, so you and I have probably the habit of getting into the weeds of story, and we talk about this stuff, and I know I fall into this trap in workshops, and people go, okay, that's great. What the hell? Huh? The darkest cave? What are you talking about? So how do you simplify this structure so that it connects with these very busy executives that aren't as studied in story as you are, and haven't certainly written a book about storytelling as you have, that we'll get into in a minute. But how do you simplify it so that they have that aha moment that, like, oh, I am a storytelling animal. I do already do this.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I do mostly is I do a lot of listening. So I hear where they are and what they're inspired by, because people that make things happen in the world, they have their own methodology and their own technique. And sometimes, I have one client who would sit before a speech, and he would sit for days and days and days, and his entire company would freeze up because he had so many ideas and so many things that he wanted to bring forth, and he didn't know how to put them into order, and he didn't know how to truly land them. Other clients that I work with, they have a bunch of different stories, but they feel old. Other people that I work with have told the same story over and over again, and everybody looks and says, wow, that's amazing, but it doesn't totally deliver on the purpose of their exact communication they're bringing. It completely depends. But part of it is just learning where people are, hearing what they mean by story, hearing the stories they tell. Maybe those stories need to have a new beginning. Maybe those stories need a deeper change. I mean, one of the things that I find with people's stories is oftentimes they don't go back to the beginning, to before this thing happened, before this change. They start from the change and they go forward. So we don't necessarily feel empathy to them. And we don't, if somebody says, well, that was the time where I'll pause for a second to, let me use one of my favorite stories, which is Gary Erickson Cliff Bar story. So the origin story of Cliff Bar came basically on a bike ride back in the 90s, where before all of these different nature bars and this bar and that bar, all of these that you walked down an entire aisle of bars. Before these all exist, there was only one. It was called Power Bar, and you probably remember the Power Bar. And so he was on a 175-mile bike ride, crazy bike rider, and he had 6 of these bars, and he had eaten 5 of them. And he just said, I can't eat another one of these bars. I just can't do it. And basically he's like, I can make a better one than this. And he had a bakery at the time. I just learned a little tidbit. He was making calzones of all things and selling them at local local restaurants. And he just got to work and figured out how to make a better bar and began from there. And now fast forward years later, and we see it in all stores and across everybody's in bike races. You see Cliff Bar everywhere, and climbers and skiers and snowboarders. Everybody knows what a Cliff Bar is. But if we just said, this guy really wanted to make a bar and he created a terrific bar and it's called Cliff Bar, it's different than setting up the tension of the beginning of the story. It's different than saying he was there on this bike ride 175 miles at the end of it and absolutely starving and feeling weak, and yet he could not eat another bar. So sometimes it's about going deeper into the moment of the setup. Sometimes it's going deeper into the challenge. Sometimes it's using more sensory detail. Sometimes you've got the wrong story for the message. Sometimes you've got just a message and no story. So there's so many different approaches. It's very, very specific to each individual. But I would say to your audience, I would say, hey, I would bet you anybody listening to this podcast has 10 stories that they probably use. And any one of those stories can be reinvigorated by taking a look and saying, am I delivering on the change? Am I going deep enough into the transformation? Am I bringing the audience to 1 or 2 scenes using sensory detail as if the audience was there with you, using your own virtual reality tools through your voice to show what that experience is, so we feel it, so we can understand that our brains do not know the difference between a well-told story and actually being there ourselves. So there's a lot of different techniques, and people can use them to transform their stories, and not just the stories they already tell, the ones that they've tried out years ago that maybe they never figured out how to tell, the stories of something that happened yesterday that you don't totally know how to make use of. So what I do is I help people develop a collection of stories, to develop and hone a collection of retellable stories, so they always have one in their pocket and they can always pull it out to deliver on a point, on a talk, on a sales pitch, on a lesson, to tell their kids something that they never quite knew how to tell them. It's about gathering those stories and making use of them.
Well, and I first heard of the Cliff Bar story on NPR's wonderful podcast called How I Built This with Guy Raz.
Oh my gosh, that's a great, I just heard that one again. Guy Raz does such a beautiful job of pulling out stories.
Doesn't he? And for all of you listening out there, if you're wondering how to find these stories, I highly recommend you listen to How I Built This, because you get inspired with every story that's told, and it's expert business storytelling, because it's all about entrepreneurs that started from absolutely nothing to get to where they are today. And it's just one of my favorites, but it's It's a superb example of storytelling in business, and that business is not all about the facts and the numbers. It's about the human impact that you have, that businesses have in the world, and then telling those stories. And I have found that if I need inspiration for my own stories, I just start pulling up and listening to those. I can use them as examples in my storytelling, or they often trigger something that I've experienced. So then I start my story bank or add to my story bank by going through that. I just think it's one of the marvelous things. The other thing you'd mentioned, he talked about the disgust once again of these bars, and he couldn't eat another one. He had totally bonked on how horrible these bars were. So once again, your story is only as good as your villain is evil. Now, that's not to say these bars were evil, but they were a problem. So in branding, marketing, and any sort of business storytelling, you're always looking at what sort of problem are you trying to solve, and how does that change in your story help your people overcome that problem, or help your customers overcome that problem? Because isn't really storytelling all about change when you get right down to it? If you don't have, as you said, transition or transformation or change in a story, you don't really have a story. You've got something in your book that I liked a lot. Well, I like very many things in your book, but particularly your journey curve, because I think it really simplifies story structure so that people can get their head around it. Take us through the journey curve, will you?
Thank you. I'm so glad that you liked that. It's really the core of the book, and it's based on, for me, it's based on an exploration that was over the course of years, where I believed that there had to be something that could be a story shape, something that every single story could match to. And I explored and studied so many different modalities. I went deep into Joseph Campbell. I studied the storytelling methodologies of great filmmakers like, studios like Pixar and Disney. I studied old improvisational techniques from a variety of different practitioners and had my own mentors. But it was a moment that I happened to find something on YouTube as I was exploring this that really changed me. And it was a very simple structure that Kurt Vonnegut, the American author, delivered on in a talk in something like 1982. It's about a minute and a half video. I really recommend everyone watches it. And he basically steps up to the chalkboard. Remember a chalkboard? It's a place. It's a thing with chalk, and there's a board. And he basically says, "Look, every single story is the same thing. Guy gets into trouble, guy gets out of trouble. People love that story. They never get tired of it." And he draws a curve, like a U-shaped curve, and basically says, the story begins up here. Otherwise, nobody will want to pay attention to it. Things have to be moderately good. And you go down, 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 and then there's a change and you're back up. Boom, that's the best story there is. I'm completely paraphrasing, but he drew out this shape of a story. And I basically took that and I said, wait a second, a story is based in change. How simple, how geometrically simple can we get? And I overlaid a variety of different philosophies to come up with a 3-pivot approach based over this U-shaped curve of Kurt Vonnegut to be that I call the journey curve. And it's based in these 3 pivots. And the first pivot is basically then one day. So the then one day is the place where it goes from how things were every day. I did this. I used to be like this. I was sitting there. I was on my bike. I was standing there at the doorway. Then one day, right? So then one day is powerful because it clearly brings us anchored into a moment, right? We are anchored in a moment. Then one day something happened, okay? Then we're into discovery, swooping down the curve all the way down because of that, into this place of challenge, this place of grit, the place where we don't know what's going to happen next. And suspense releases dopamine. So as the storyteller, you want to be taking them on a journey with a twist, a journey where they don't know where the end is, right? And so the second pivot is until finally. Okay? Until finally I came out with a new bar, until finally I gathered together the people who I'd previously worked against in a coalition to help people to fix their roofs, until finally I created a business around the world that drew people around the world focused on human connection, until finally I decided I was going to cure cancer naturally, until finally. Okay, so until finally is, if your audience forgets every single thing in this talk, I want them to remember the until finally moment, because the until finally has the power of bringing us from that innermost cave moment, that deep, dark place of mystery where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you give the due pause that is required from that place of mystery, and it brings us into the until finally. Until finally, I came up with the idea that would change the rest of my life. Okay, so that's the bottom of the curve. That's the second pivot. Remember, the first pivot was the then one day. The second pivot is the until finally. And the third pivot, as we come back up the U curve, is the ever since then. The ever since then is very important because it anchors the change in today. It shows us what the impact of that decision. It reveals the lesson, if there is a lesson. It reveals the transformation, if there is a transformation. It reveals the simple shift, if there is a simple shift that has changed everything for you or for the storyteller. So the journey curve is about a journey. And that's the thing that I love about it, is because I began my career as a traveler. I was on the road for several years, working here to there, from Europe to South America to Asia, and just working and just absorbing the amazing cultures and people of this earth. And so I love travel stories. And I later became an entrepreneur and focused on business and startups. But I love travel stories, and I think that every good story has some components that are very similar to a travel story. And so the journey curve is about the small journeys and the great journeys, the micrology, the smallest bits of our day, and the mythology, the great changes that shift lives, that shift companies, that shift cultures. And so I have taken this journey curve and applied it to thousands of stories, and I have shared it with thousands of people. And I'm really happy to say that not only is it something that really works for me to help my clients, but I'm hearing people every day that are using the journey curve to change their own stories and to teach them, their own clients and their own audiences and their own students, about how to look at a story and look at any story and how to shape it and how to change it and how to make it retellable.
And that journey curve really only works when you understand the moments. I mean, because it's all about the moments that have impact. And I'm just finishing up Dan and Chip Heath's, I guess, relatively new book, The Power of Moments: Why Certain Experiences Have Extraordinary Impact. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the kind of book that outlines the different kinds of moments that we come across day in and day out. And I think people, as they're talking about, if they're working with their teams internally at organizations, and maybe they're leading a change initiative or an innovation or whatever, to be able to map out these moments in the journey for their audiences. And this book is a really good guide of the kinds of moments to go after. But without those moments, your journey curve and really any story doesn't work. It always comes back down to those pivotal moments that have, at the time, quite often seem inconsequential, but can become enormously impactful and shape who you are as a professional, or shape an organization and or a brand.
It's such a great point, and all I can say is hooray for that book. And I'm a big fan of Dan and Chip Heath, and the idea that you have to anchor in a moment in order to bring your audience into this into this experience. But then the key is you can't stay in that moment too long, nor can you show too many moments, right? So it's a balance of zooming in and zooming out. You zoom into a moment in time and you show them the scene. They suddenly forget about their email and their texts and what they want to have for lunch because they're there with you in that moment. They're in the suspense of what's going to happen now and why the heck you're telling that story. And then you zoom across time. It might be across a day or an hour or a week or a year, and you go to a different moment. And in that moment, this next change occurs. And so then you come to the ever since then, and in that ever since then, the change is anchored, and you've brought them into the payoff, right? That's the oxytocin, that release where they say, wow, yes, I now understand what you are saying. And in fact, then you set the challenge. You say, well, you don't say this, but I sometimes say it. I say, tomorrow I'm going to ask you what you remembered from this day, and I want to know what that is. Was it the stories or was it the data?
Exactly. It's always the stories, isn't it? Now, we're recording the show just after the Golden Globes. Did you happen to see Oprah Winfrey's presentation at the Golden Globes?
I absolutely did. And I was sharing this idea that the first minute and 40 seconds of that talk was absolutely prototypical powerful storytelling where she didn't give a kind of soft introduction. She went boom right into another place and time. The audience was captivated. She took us to another age. She created an immersive experience, and she directed it into another place where she brought Sidney Poitier in. She revealed the change that it had to her, and she turned it, and she revealed the change that it has on every audience member. And watching that being passed around is so powerful. I'm not only inspired, but I'm just grateful that she came out with that terrific story.
Well, it's going to be absolutely iconic if it isn't already. She did follow. I mean, in 9 minutes, she shared 7 different stories. I've heard it told as a story of stories, and each one of these stories captured their own moment and had their own point that she was trying to make. And again, she was coming and railing against 2 villains. Your story is only as good as your villain is evil. And what were those 2 villains that she was railing against? Sexual abuse, sexual harassment,
and
prejudice, and the President of the United States, and what has happened in our highest offices. So she has 2 points, and by the way, they're both coming out talking about injustice, fairness, kindness, and in a lot of cases, disgust once again plays into this. So it's interesting. She has those kinds of points, taking these moments captured in these 7 stories, told in a 9-minute overall arching narrative, and such a call to arms. It has people all over the world sharing that.
Yeah, and I want to say that I completely respect what you're saying about the idea of the villain. I identify more deeply with the idea that you said about the problem. I think you can go deep into a problem without being necessarily against a something or or a someone. A lot of these challenges that people face and the things that happen in a retellable story are truly internal. They're challenges, they're problems that the teller has come upon themselves, or some barrier that's not necessarily a villain, but it is a real problem, and it is something that they have to figure out how to overcome. And it is in that consideration from an audience perspective of how they will do it that becomes the fascinating part of the story. And I'll give you an example. This weekend, I sat home with my 12-year-old son, and my wife and our daughter. They went out dancing at a friend's house, and we sat home and we watched a movie, and we watched 127 Hours. You remember this? So it's not a new movie, but it is a timeless movie, and I wanted to see it with my son. It's one of those stories already what's going to happen. You already know the story. But wait a second, if you already know the story, how can it be so amazing to take in? And that is because of the mastery of the teller. It is because of the fearlessness of the teller to bring us deep into the visceral experience of challenge, where we don't know in that moment what's going to happen, even though outside we know that somehow the change is going to happen. We know what occurs at the end of the story. And yet in that moment, we're so deep in the experience, that we're so alive in that experience, that the change is that much more of a payoff.
Mm-hmm. And I think why I go towards villain, and I push back on this, because so often business leaders pussyfoot around what is really at stake, the elephant in the room. And yeah, we've got a problem. We have a change initiative. You know, they dress it up with all kinds of accoutrements without getting right down to it. So I have found it's helpful to get the brain to stop thinking about business and start trying to get it in a narrative sense. And it's, as you had said earlier, without change, you have no story. Well, without change, I mean, with all change, there is conflict, because we basically don't want to change. So we're going to have some sort of conflict moving us from status quo into something new, into the unknown, which also means that we are going to now bring up problems that we're going to have to overcome in order to make this change happen, because it's never as simple as snapping your fingers and boom, the change has been made. So I often start, in fact, in my story cycle process, when I'm looking at chapter 4, I literally call it villains, fog, and crevasses. And the reason being is I want people to get out of their left logical business brain and into their right narrative brain around story. Well, what do you mean by villains exactly, Park? Well, the obstacles and antagonists that stand in your way, the fog, what don't you don't know, or what don't your clients know about you that you need to reveal to them to clear the fog away, and the crevasses, what are you helping them overcome? And or what do you have to overcome? What do you might be saying one thing, but you're doing something completely differently. So you now have a gap in how you're walking your talk. And I just find that I do push for the villains and I push for the big problems, because if I don't push there, I get business leaders that pussyfoot around it. And I find that that's the fastest way to get there.
I completely get it, and in fact, I love that what you're saying with the magical three there of the villain, the fog, and the crevasse, because it might not be a villain, but I hear what you're saying. You if you push in that direction and you get them into that mode, it totally makes sense. And then you might say, well, okay, today it might not be a villain, but it's a hell of a crevasse. So
exactly right.
So let's look at that.
That villain, maybe. One of the biggest villains is fear. Fear is our greatest foil. It's that voice in the back of our head that says you're not smart enough. What the hell are you doing? What makes you think you can pull this off? Well, if you characterize that as just being insecure or fearful, that's one thing. That's kind of high level abstract. Or if you say, no, that's actually a villain. That's someone there. That's an inner terrorist that says you're not good enough. And who the hell is that inner terrorist to say that about you? So, all right, so you've overcome that. You've got you put the fear aside and you've wrestled it to the ground and you're moving on. And then to your point, oh my God, fog, I don't know that I know everything that I need to know to make this change happen. So they embrace that obstacle and they start learning and they clear, the way for the path, the pursuit, only to find then gaps and crevasses in operations, in sales and timing and whatever it is. But I'd love to just get people out of their logical business minds and into their storytelling brains to reframe the challenges that they're up against. And I think this story is an extraordinarily powerful way to do that.
Makes sense. I love it. Yeah. And for me, I think I'm always the low hanging fruit for me is when I get in, because I do a lot of coaching with founders and with leaders that are doing a lot of public speaking. And the low hanging fruit for me is what was surprising.
Yeah.
What changed for you there? What happened in this most recent trip? Because we might be working on some big story, but we overlook the small story that's got incredible relevance to this point today. And so I think it's a great filter.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Now, you got your book, Retellable, How Your Essential Stories Unlock Power and Purpose. And I really, really enjoyed reading this book. It's a quick read, which I like. It's not like I had to, dig through volumes of information. You've done a beautiful job of simplifying it for every reader, but really giving people a good methodology or framework to work from to simplify so that they can start finding their stories. How long did it take you to put this book together, and what are your plans with it now?
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear that. And I have so many bookmarks at about page 175 in books that I read, and so I vowed myself to not write past that bookmark. So so
Very wise.
to keep it pocket sized was a big job. And yeah, I set out. I said, look, I'm gonna write this book. It's time to write this book. I'm gonna dedicate the next 3 months to get this up and going. And I got 3 months in, and I looked at it and I said, wow, this is going to be a long journey. So I set out for a 6-month journey, and I was done in a short 4.5 years. So it was a happy experience that happened mostly between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. because I found that with 2 young kids, that was the time, especially between 5 and 8, that I could actually get quiet and truly get to the words that needed to be written.
And you called it Retellable, I guess, because that's what you ultimately want to get your customers, your clients to, is to get them to a point that they can share a story that is so compelling that people make it their own and retell it and share it.
That's right. It's the basic litmus test for a story. After entering into this, realizing that my territory was going to be story 10 years ago, and I kind of arrived as if in some great new city, and I said, oh, well, this is really much bigger than I imagined, even though people already called me a storyteller for years and years, and I had done a lot of online media and a lot of web series and video and quote storytelling. But once you get to that, you say story is the thing. It's not the media delivery system. It's the actual story. I then said, oh, well, what's the territory that's smaller than that? What's the true territory that I feel like I can wrap my hands around? Because I'm not focusing on the social media storytelling. I'm not focusing on the video storytelling. I'm focused on that primal territory. And I said, that basic piece of retellability, that basic piece of what we remember in such a fast-paced world, even not just around us, but even of our own lives, all of these rich experiences that we each have in our life, how do we remember them, and how do we put words to them, and how do we deliver them to our most critical audiences, whether they're huge audiences. I one of my clients told a story in front of 25,000 people this past year in Texas Stadium, or the equally critical stories of when you're when you're interviewing for your next job, or when you're talking at a dinner meeting and delivering the true essence of why you do this work. That retellable story is the intent to rise above the noise and to survive until tomorrow and until next week. And so that's why I called it Retellable.
Okay, and that's all well and good, but what do you do when you get somebody that says, and you hear this a lot, I'm sure, because I hear it a lot, I don't have any good stories to tell. Nobody wants to hear about my stupid story. I'm not going to tell that story. That has nothing to do with business. How do you get people over that mindset?
Well, those are 2 separate buckets. I'd say that the latter bucket, which is why would I tell this for a business audience, is a really interesting question. I think the question is, what do you truly have to offer? And not just that, but what do you really want to, where do you want to take your audience? That's the real question. When you ask the question, recognizing that your audience is here today and you want them to head in some different direction and embrace some different idea, the question is, how do you do it? And when you ask that question, how do you take that audience and transform them and take them in a different direction, you have to ask, is it the data that's going to do that? Is it the explanation that's going to do that? or is it the story that's going to do that? And for me, I just have to say, number one, what do we remember? Number two, what do we know since the beginning of time that has transformed culture? And number three, what are the things that you can remember about your own life that has created transformation? And I would say, tell me about those. And soon as you know it, we'd be talking about stories.
So, what are the three biggest mistakes people make when they think about storytelling?
I think that the first part that people miss is that they don't go far back enough. So if you're telling a story, people don't set the scene well enough and don't establish that connection early on with the audience, so we know we're going on a journey and we understand the context of the beginning of that journey. Again, whether this is a lifelong journey, a epically transformative journey, or just something that was powerful that happened yesterday. So the first part is people don't go far back enough. The second part is people don't go deep enough. They don't go deep into those two or three moments in time that anchor in the senses, that truly connect us to that powerful experience of a story. They don't use the techniques of the ancient storytellers to ground in time and place.
Such as what? Like being specific about the
Well,
location and time and place?
yeah, it's like well, so yesterday there I was on a plane and I was flying here and I wasn't sure if I was going to make it or not, but then I did and I was really happy I did, and I got here late, and I'm glad to be here. Or you could say I was sitting on this plane flying over Southern Oregon, and I looked down and I saw an epic blanket of fog, and I heard on the loudspeaker of the plane the pilot saying, "It's okay, we've got a 1/4 mile visibility, we're going in." And I looked down and I said, I don't know what kind of 1/4 mile you've got, but I can't see anything down there, and I've spent my whole life living in fog. This is super scary. And we went down and down and down and down, and the next thing I saw was cars 50 feet below me, and I looked down, and the next thing I knew, bump, 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 skid, and we landed safely in Medford. I could just say, I was on a plane yesterday, and it was a little bit scary. And you can use the word scary, but unless you bring someone into that moment, we don't feel it viscerally, and thus we're not connected to the story. So the first part is you don't go far back enough because you're wanting to set up a module of change. That's what a story is. You want to set up a module of change, so you have to take us enough to how the world was. And the second part is you want to take us far enough down into those moments, as you described earlier. Take us into those 1 or 2 or 3 moments so we can feel it. We're there with you. And then the third thing I would say is make sure you anchor and reveal the change. It doesn't mean that there's a moral to the story always, because there isn't. It doesn't mean that there's authentically a lesson that you always take away that's life-changing, but it does mean that there's something that changed that relates very much to what you're saying right now. So to take this little module of experience, this module of change that had an incremental shift on you or a massive shift on the audience around you, is to do those three things. Make sure you set up the change, make sure you anchor enough in sensory detail, and make sure that you reveal that change and link it to your audience.
Huh. That's fantastic. So full circle, you're out of the Bay Area and the hustle and bustle of that up to Ashland, Oregon. What's the greatest change you've made in your life in doing that, or has impacted your life?
When I was in the Bay Area, being a person that goes looking for adventure, I spent a lot of time swimming in the San Francisco Bay, in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. And that was where I would find my invigoration, is that going into the cold water, keeping my heart rate up, going off to some edge of the aquatic park, swimming around a buoy, coming back, facing the waves, coming back, and coming out of the water entirely invigorated, feeling like a new person. When I was there, I did that because in the city, sometimes it's hard to find that edge, and it was for me. And so that's what I did there. And a lot of times now I hear people say, oh my gosh, because I spoke a lot and I wrote a lot about those experiences. And people say, well, what are you doing? Where are you swimming? And I'm not swimming at all. I'm taking up trail running again. So I go out and I leave my phone behind and I go off into the silence and head out for the trails, which are near our house, and do some remembering on my own to remember the whole point of this journey, the whole point of making these shifts, to come back to those critical stories and insights that I've myself have carried in my life. And that's I believe that's part of the practice, to not just come up with the stories, but to come up with the insights behind them. So I think that's one of the big things that's changed for me, is that I'm not swimming, but also from a business perspective, not having that constant connection, constant innovators swirling all around me. It's not the same in this town. It's a lot more low key, and so I spend more time on the phone. I spend more time on my own, and I spend a lot more time with my kids.
Well, Jay, I appreciate you spending time with us right here today on Business's Story. Thanks so much. And where can folks find this wonderful book, Retellable: How Your Essential Stories Unlock Power and Purpose?
Thank you so much. Retellable is on Kindle. It's in print on Amazon.com, and it's also on Audible, because I was told by an ally of mine that you want to write your last draft of the story after you've spoken the entire book aloud. He set that standard for me. So I said, okay, I'm going to do my last edit after I read the entire book into a microphone. So that's on Audible, and you can also find a lot of this blog posts and information about my work on retellable.com.
Well, thanks, Jay. Thanks for being here. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us on this edition of the Business of Story. Now we're fast into 2018, and I hope you have taken the time to really get your story straight, whether it's your brand story for your personal career path and growing your influence, or if it's your organizational brand story to get your people holding in the same direction and having that impact in the world you're looking for. And that's what it's all about here at Business of Stories, to help you do that, help you clarify your story, amplify your impact, and believe it or not, like Jay has done up there, simplify your life. When you get really crystal clear in your story, all those come together. And I can help you at businessofstory.com, so head on over there. And if you haven't yet downloaded your DIY Brand Story Strategy Workbook to start clarifying your work, do it right now. I'd love to have it. And remember to join us again next week, when we'll have another story artist like Jay here to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And until then, remember, the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one.